First thing I want to do is say that the name of the book has changed. So you'll be introduced to the book. I'm in the middle of fighting with my editor, literally this minute, about what the book's going to be called. So I'm going to tell you a different title while I'm talking, and then it's going to come out under a totally different title in about a year. So that's one thing I want to say. And the second thing I want to say is the project that Joanna mentioned is a collaborative project, the Digital Trust Foundation project, with Malavika Jayaram, who's here, and then 3 amazing community researchers, Tamika Lewis in Charlotte, North Carolina, Tawana Petty in Detroit, Michigan, and Mariela Saba in Los Angeles. So I just wanted to, that's not all me, it's a wonderful team of folks. But I am Virginia Eubanks, and I'm really excited to be here. And I want to get sort of a temperature check in the room, right? It's a foggy, kind of rainy day, it's a little bit of a beige room. A bunch of people who are here have been sitting in a small meeting room all day long already. So I want people to give me like happy twinkle fingers if their energy is pretty good and they're ready to go. Down, bad, evil twinkle fingers. Yeah, see, there's some evil twinkle fingers. Good. No, that's what this, it's information. It's data, right? And this is an ongoing thing. So happy fingers if I'm saying something you want me to say more about. Sad twinkle fingers if you're getting bored and you want me to move on, because there's some fantastic folks who are going to speak up for me. So just, it's a minimum interaction, but it's slightly interactive. I also really want to thank Lena, Arn, Joanna, and Sarah for all of their hard work getting me here and this opportunity to engage in what I think is a really important conversation, and also to really celebrate the Data Justice Lab, which I'm super excited to see what happens, and I hope that this is a beginning of a long relationship, and not just my first time ever to Wales. And I also want to thank everyone in the room who was at the earlier meeting today, really to thank you for your energy and your enthusiasm and the incredible smarts that everybody is bringing to this ongoing discussion. And like I said, hopefully this is just the beginning of a longer conversation that we'll continue to have, because sort of the stakes of things that we're talking about as datafication or the opacity of algorithms or the limits of privacy, the stakes are actually really high. They're really material and really immediate for a lot of folks. But the way we talk about these things often gets really abstract really fast. They're often complicated technical systems. They're often things that are what people will call black boxed, meaning that they're built inside sort of a dark area and you never get to see in it. So it makes perfect sense that these things would get abstract quickly. But each of these things really does have immediate material consequence for millions of people. And over the last 3 years, I've been traveling all over the United States, talking primarily to poor and working class people about how new database tools in human and social services are affecting their lives, are impacting their day-to-day lives. So what I'd like to do to sort of ground this conversation in the concrete and to start in the lives of those folks is to start with some of the human stories behind the big picture of the rise of what I call the new regime of data. So I'm going to start with the story of Omega Young. In the fall of 2008, Omega Young of Evansville, Indiana, missed an appointment to recertify for Medicaid because she was in the hospital suffering from terminal cancer. The cancer that began in her ovaries spread to her kidneys, breast, and liver. Her chemotherapy left her weak and emaciated. And Young, a mother of 2 grown sons, was really struggling to meet the requirements of a new automated eligibility system for welfare, Medicaid, and food stamps. So she called her county help center to let them know that she was hospitalized, so she couldn't make an appointment to recertify for Medicaid, and her medical benefits and food stamps were cut off. The reason was a sort of catch-all phrase that they were using called failure to cooperate with establishing eligibility for Medicaid. And the eligibility modernization system that was happening in Indiana was launched in 2006, was led by a team of high-tech companies, including IBM and ACS. And the system actually interpreted any mistake that was made in applying for social programs, applications that are often anywhere from 10 to 35 pages long. Any one mistake was interpreted by the system as affirmative refusal to comply with the rules of the agency. and thus gave the agency reason to sanction or deny people for failure to cooperate, like Omega Young. Because she lost her benefits, Young was unable to afford her medications. She lost her food stamps. She struggled to pay her rent. She lost access to free transportation for medical appointments. And Omega Young died on March 1st, 2009. The next day, on March 2nd, she won an appeal for wrongful termination and all of her benefits were restored. Okay, so that's story one. Story two is Uncle Gary Boatwright. So when I met Uncle Gary in May 2016, he was living in a gray and green tent on East 6th Street on the edge of Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles. He's a straight-talking, very funny man, and he has sort of thinning white hair and these like Santa Claus blue twinkly eyes. He's had a dozen careers: welder, mason, paralegal, door-to-door salesman, law student, and most recently he was a document processor for a wholesale mortgage lender, one that actually was named one of the top subprime companies that most responsible for cratering the United States economy. So we met to talk about the system called coordinated entry, which attempts to match unhoused people in Los Angeles County with appropriate available housing interventions. They call it the Match.com of homeless services. The process includes a comprehensive survey that's called, as all these things have crazy acronyms, it's called the VI-SPDAT, which stands for the Vulnerability Index Service Decision Assistance Tool. I'll just call it the VI-SPDAT. Interaction, thank you. Okay, so the VI-SPDAT includes some really invasive, comprehensive questions that specifically focus on risky behavior. And I'll just give you one. And think maybe to yourself about how you feel about answering this question. Do you ever do things that may be considered to be risky? Like exchange sex for money, run drugs for someone, have unprotected sex with someone you don't know, share a needle, or anything like that. So the survey responses to the VI-SPDAT are entered into an electronic registry of the homeless, and a ranking algorithm gives each person what's called a vulnerability score, which is then used to create a prioritized list of homeless people who might qualify for a shrinking number of spots in permanent supportive housing. Just to contextualize, there's 44,000 homeless people in Los Angeles, which is the size of the city that I live in, right? So my entire city is homeless in Los Angeles. And one of the things that's unique about Los Angeles, like New York City has 52,000 homeless people, but most of them are in some kind of shelter. Often it's not safe shelter, and it's certainly not, it certainly can be an assault on human dignity, but it's some kind of shelter. In Los Angeles, approximately 80% of the people who are homeless are completely unhoused, meaning they're living in a tent on the sidewalk, or they're living in a car or under a bridge. So Gary's taken the VI-SPDAT 3 times. Each person he's taken it with has told him that they can do better with the survey than the last person he took it with. But he still doesn't think he scored very high. So he's 64, but he's healthy besides a little high blood pressure and some loss of hearing. His substance abuse isn't abusive or debilitating. He found out that he has a mental health record in Orange County, but he doesn't know what's in it because no one ever told him. It just came up when he was in court once. So no one's ever shared his diagnosis with him. So he feels like his score on a scale of 0 to 17 is probably not very high. It's probably like an 8. So the problem he sees is not his comparative vulnerability to other homeless folks. It's simple math. There's not enough housing in Los Angeles to house the 44,000 homeless people. And so he said to me, people like me who are somewhat higher functioning, we're just not getting housing. It's another way of kicking the can down the road. In order to house the homeless, you have to have available units. Show me the units, otherwise you're lying. So this November, Gary was arrested. He was charged with breaking the window of a public bus with a 99-cent store broom, which he argues is actually physically impossible. Like those plastic, really sort of sad rooms. When he gets out, he will have lost everything. His tent, his paperwork, his relationship with local organizations and friends, and he will score lower on the VI-SPDAT because for the period of time that he was incarcerated, it's counted as being housed. So the model will actually see him as less vulnerable, and his priority score will slip even lower. So that's Uncle Gary Boatwright. Last story is Angel Shepard and Patrick Grady. So I met Angel Shepard and Patrick Grady at the Duquesne Family Support Center, which is a community hub that serves in struggling families, all families, but it mostly works with low-income families, in the impoverished suburbs that ring Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, also the home of the Uber self-driving car. And the couple didn't really stand out to me right away. As a journalist, right, you're always looking for like the sexiest story and like the worst case scenario. And so they totally didn't stand out because their experience is so utterly average. It's so completely characteristic of the routine, mundane indignities of being poor in America. So they struggled with low-wage, dangerous work, poor quality schools, and predatory private online colleges, poor health, community violence. And also, between the two of them, they've racked up more than half a dozen interactions with an agency that many poor families come into contact with, but many middle-class people never really know exists, which is the Allegheny County Office of Children, Youth, and Families, CYF. Sometimes people call it in the US CPS, Child Protective Services. So Patrick was investigated for medical neglect in the early 2000s when he was unable to afford his daughter Tabitha's antibiotic prescription after an emergency room visit. When Angel's daughter Harriet was 5, an anonymous tipster phoned in a string of reports to the Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline and suggested that she was unsupervised, that she was down the block teasing a dog, that she wasn't properly clothed, fed, or bathed, and that she wasn't receiving needed medication. For each call, an investigator came to the house, interviewed Harriet and Tabitha, Angel and Patrick, the neighbors, the school teachers, looked in all the cupboards, looked under all the beds, and requested access to the family's medical records. Often these visits come at night, by the way, so they can, see what really happens at the home. But it's actually, of course, incredibly disruptive for families who, like, kids are sleeping and have to be pulled out of bed and stuff. In each case, they found no evidence of maltreatment and closed the case. Each of these interactions, though, was entered into the family's case file, which is held in an integrated data warehouse that was developed by the agency in 1999. And since August 2016, anytime a hotline call is received on potential child maltreatment, a statistical risk model is run to try and predict which children are at greatest risk for abuse and neglect. And among the variables that are most crucial to the algorithm are things like past interactions with the CYF system, like Angel and Patrick have, and also the use of supportive services for poor families, food stamps, county medical services, cash assistance, mental health records, stuff like that. So Patrick and Angel basically live in terror that there'll be another call on their family and that the algorithm will target their daughter and their granddaughter for investigation and possibly for removal to foster care. And it is a not irrational fear because one of the things that the algorithm really tests for is intensive use of county services. And Patrick and Angel have come in contact with a lot of county services, but they've also sought them out. They've sought them out explicitly to be better parents. They've become part of community organizations that serve other poor parents. And they're very involved with the system. So Angel said to me, you feel like a prisoner. You feel trapped. It's like no matter what you do, it isn't good enough for them. My daughter's now 9, and I'm still afraid they're going to come up one day and see her out by herself in the yard, pick her up, and say, you can't have her anymore. Okay, so these are my 3 stories. The automation of welfare eligibility in Indiana, the electronic registry of the homeless in Los Angeles, and the child maltreatment prediction model in Allegheny County in Pennsylvania that form the heart of my new book, which is called Today, Digital Denial, How High-Tech Tools Hide Inequality, Undercut Democracy, and Punish the Poor. And I want to offer them a way of sort of grounding this fascinating conversation we're having today in the specific lived reality of people's lives, and particularly in the lives of people who are facing the most dangerous and invasive impacts of the new regime of data. And I also offer them, because if you start from the point of view of Omega Young or Gary Boatwright or Angel and Patrick, it really upends many of the assumptions we take for granted when we talk about data, algorithms, privacy, and transparency. Is anyone checking how much time I have left?
Yeah.
Do I have 5 minutes still?
7.
Oh, this is great. Okay, so in celebration of the Data Justice Lab today, I want to offer some kind of provocations that arise from these stories. And I offer them really in the hope and in the faith that it'll spur us to our sort of deepest, most critical thinking and really help communicate the sense of urgency, like why we should care about these things that often feel very abstract. And I hope that'll set up Malavika and Steven to discuss some of the great campaign work they're doing out in the world in a minute. So just 3 provocations. The first is that this idea that the new regime of data inevitably disrupts old forms of power and privilege, right? The sort of cheerleaders or the prophets of datafication love to say this, right? Big data disrupts business practices. Algorithms disrupt bureaucracies. But as often as the regime of data dismantles old power relationships, it reaffirms older and often more punitive power relationships and forms of government. So in the book, actually, I argue that the new regime of data, at least in the human and social services in the US, is absolutely in line with the punitive poverty policies of our past. Everything from the county poorhouse from the 1820s, here you might also call them almshouses or workhouses, I'll just put it all under poorhouse. So from county poorhouses to scientific casework. Like older practices, the objects of these systems is to contain the poor, to investigate and police them, and I think most importantly, to create complicated moral classifications that allow policymakers and frontline caseworkers to make what are at heart inhuman decisions, impossible decisions. Which families have food and which starve, who is sheltered and who lives on the street, and which families are pulled apart by the state. So the provocation I want to offer here is, how do we know which political and value systems will be disrupted and which will be affirmed, right, when we talk about these new data practices? And then more importantly, how do we push these systems towards disrupting oppressive institutions and reaffirming values that support abundance, justice, and democracy? So that's the first provocation. The second provocation is the idea that the new regime of data impacts everyone in the same way. So the whole point of datafication, or the new regime of data, is actually to slice the world into finer and finer classifications. So it's really sort of asked backwards to respond to that increasing sophistication of classification with sort of blanket one-size-fits-all solutions. Like, we need more transparency, or we need clearer privacy language, or we need to audit algorithms. Because an algorithm that finds you sort of the perfect pair of peak-toe pumps on Zappos is like a very, very different beast from the algorithm that identifies problem gamblers so that casinos can target market to them and most efficiently drain them of all their resources. Those are just completely different things, and we need to deal with them as different things. So the provocation here is, how do we recognize the fact that data doesn't land on smooth ground? How do we center the experiences of those folks who see themselves as the targets, not the beneficiaries of these systems, especially the poor, communities of color, unpopular religious groups, migrants, sexual minorities, and other folks? And my final provocation is the idea that more data or information inevitably leads to better policy. So there are a lot of people who are incredibly smart about data, information, and complex systems, but we're often naive, even remarkably naive, about politics. Part of the reason, I think, is that those of us who sort of seek to harness computational power for social justice tend to have a kind of an affinity for systems engineering approaches to problems. And system engineering basically assumes that you can manage complex systems by getting correct information where it needs to go as quickly and efficiently as possible. But that assumption relies on the idea that political conflicts only emerge from ignorance, right? You just don't know any better. And if we just had all the facts, the correct answers to intractable policy problems like homelessness or child maltreatment will be simple, clear, and of course shared by everyone, because they will be apolitical, because the facts will be apolitical. This just isn't true, and this isn't the way that politics works at all. Our political conflicts are more than informational, right? They're about values, they're about how we identify with groups and identifying group membership, and they're frankly about legitimately conflicting interests, right? So in LA, there's legitimately conflicting interests between the unhoused folks who are looking for, to attain their basic human right to housing, the downtown businesses who want like a clean, safe, walkable, fun downtown LA, the police who are looking to contain and investigate what they see as a criminal population, though most of those crimes are status crimes and not very dangerous to anyone but the people engaged in them. And to the government of the city and the taxpayers who don't want to see homeless people but don't want to pay for housing, right? Having the right number for the number of homeless people and how vulnerable they are compared to each other is not going to solve that problem. That is an intractable political problem. So the provocation here is, how do we put data in its proper place in our social justice work? Because of course we want more better data, but we can't assume that the right information will somehow magically bend the moral arc of the universe towards justice. And that's why I'm really excited to be here today and to talk about what work this organization, this group, and these folks can do. And thank you so much for your time and attention, and twinkle fingers.